Like I saw, like, there's one person out there that is in this class as well, but I don't know if they're coming in.
Right?
So we have the Halloween party that we're going tonight, and running around with little kids all night.
What you gonna dress up?
Oh yeah, I'm gonna dress up because they wanted me to. So I'm either gonna be like I literally have both of the outfits because I've already been both of them like in real life.
That's a good thing because my daughter is about she's put into this morning, but her birthday is the 8th, so yeah, accommodate for that. So she wanted something to do with Little Mermaid. So she wanted to be tried.
Oh my goodness.
And I was like, I know, it's like,
That's cute though. Like probably I'll be a tennis player or a lifeguard because I have both of the things for that and I have sweatshirts for both of them.
oh, that's cool.
So I'll be one of those. I try to I think my little sister is gonna dress up as a boxer. So hi again. You found that costume? Yeah, but I'm not wearing it. It's like, so I got like a big orange t-shirt because we were gonna try to be like the fairies from like Tinkerbell or whatever. So we all got like big t-shirts and we cut them off, but mine was just really too short. And I'm like, I'm gonna be running around with little kids all night trying to like go trick or treating with them and not lose them so their parents don't kill me. Then I'm gonna wear something else. So tennis player or lifeguard because I have all of those clothes already.
There's always the possibility that the parents might want you to lose them.
Yeah, there's a set of twins that are like 3, and I don't know if I'm gonna have them tonight or not. I hope I don't. Let's just put it that way. I really hope that I don't. I'll give my little sister the harder kids to take care of. She's mean.
Still better than me in P2 class the other day where nobody showed up. It was all online.
Were they supposed to like show up though? Or like could they?
They could if they wanted to, but that day nobody did. So
When was that?
last week,
Last week.
yeah, they were all there online. I could see them all, but they were, nobody was here. We'll see what happens today.
And, I could just be a nurse and wear my scrubs.
Do you want me to just
Yeah.
walk you guys?
Yeah.
Don't overdo it now. Don't work too hard, Mark.
Are you Aaron Price?
Yes.
Okay.
There you go. I know it's taken me a while. I know like you 4.
Yeah.
Or you 3. I know Kirsten too. That's about it.
His name is.
Yeah, I knew if I
Yeah.
was sworn out, I had a 50-50 chance. to get rid of
He's
it.
online. I already,
He's a man, yes.
I
Yeah,
saw
already-
him, I was like, oh, I need to-
so. Okay. So let's get started. we're going to wrap up bones today in lecture and then start going into muscles. So let's go ahead and get this open. And we have been talking about three types of conditions. We had mentioned osteoporosis and osteopenia as a type of bone disease and all the consequences that go with that. We don't know, we have an idea why an individual, an older female, will develop osteoporosis, but we don't know what the trigger might be, because there's always going to, about 30% of the female population past menopause will get osteoporosis. Many more will develop osteopenia where they have low mineralization, but there's no, the cause is always said, well, it was, poor calcium intake prior to menopause. It's caused by a lack of estrogen, but a lot of women post-menopause don't develop it. So there is some, sometimes there's just no rhyme or reason to why things happen. Now, here's something that we used to see a lot of, and then antibiotics came along in the 1940s and it went away. And now it seems to be making a comeback as we develop antibiotic resistance. This is known as osteomyelitis. It's an infection in the bone marrow. And what it does, it is essentially flesh-eating bacteria of different types. If there's a penetration of the tissue with the bone, a fracture, then bacteria can penetrate. And what would happen was it would migrate into the bone marrow, it would grow in there, and bacteria loves a warm, dark, moist environment, and it would grow and it would be fatal. It would eventually overwhelm the individual and kill them. Well, then antibiotics came along and stopped all that. Well, now we have conditions like MRSA. Anybody know what MRSA is? Okay, MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. Well, that is an antibiotic-resistant bacteria. What happens now in some cases, we often call it flesh-eating bacteria too. Individuals will have an injury, expose the bone, and the bone will start to rot from the inside because of this bacteria. Essentially, the bacteria will overwhelm the bone and destroy it and can still be fatal. We hear about individuals, individuals on a zip line, and they fall off, the zip line breaks and they fall into a river and they break their leg, and then after 2 weeks or so, they have to have their leg amputated and maybe an arm or maybe 2 arms, or something along the same lines, or they get a cut or a scratch, a penetrating injury, and it attacks other bones in the body. And so it happens. It has made a reappearance, probably not to the level as it did before, because lots of people have compound fractures of their bones and don't develop this. Yeah.
I've heard a lot of people, most of the time, get that at the hospital.
Mm-hmm. They do. Hospitals are notorious for the spread of these bacteria, because that's where everybody's. You have lots of infections, and no matter how hard you work, it's easy to spread. It was discovered that one of the most common ways to spread a bacteria are from the doctors, because the doctors will examine a patient, scrub up, clean up, go to the next patient, bend over to examine them, and when they bend over, their tie comes in contact with the patient if they're wearing a tie. Some do, some don't. And then they go to the next patient and they do the same thing, and they spread that way. It was very innocent, and so the simple thing like buttoning their lab coat or tucking their tie in or whatever, or just wear scrubs, and it prevents the contact. It is it is spread through contact, touch, and it is very common in the hospitals. Particularly if you have like IV lines, that stay in for a long time. That's a good place for that kind of bacteria to grow. Now, does that mean every time you have an IV line, you're going to get flesh-eating bacteria or dissolve your bones? Probably not. But it's always a risk factor in some particular injury that occurs in a particularly pathogen-filled environment, like falling into a river is never a good thing, and breaking your leg when you hit the river. That's never good. But it can be really simple things too. So, because bacteria are present everywhere. So I'm not saying you shouldn't zip line. I'm just saying that that seems to be where a lot of them occur. Yeah.
One of my friend's little sister was on like the playground when she was little, like scraped her knee and was put in the hospital because it got infected and it was on her knee, so it got into like her bone or whatever, and they fought it with like antibiotics and stuff, but it was just weird because it had been fine for a couple weeks and then all of a sudden she was like sick, and it wasn't a part of her knee, it was just like her whole body.
It became a systemic infection. Yeah. So, well, my nephew, when he was at Georgia Southern, about 4 or 5 years ago, there was a student there that went ziplining at some nearby river. Georgia Southern is, I'm sorry, that was my niece. She's at Georgia Southern. She was at Georgia Southern. He was at Western Georgia. They went to opposite ends of the state. I don't know why, but brother and sister. But he was at Western Georgia, and they had a student there. While he was there, he was telling me about it, that went ziplining at some nearby river, and the line broke, and she ended up losing both legs and one arm because of that. So it can happen. Even a fall in the playground, so it doesn't have to be anything as dramatic as a zip line breaking. But it could be any kind of infection. We don't know what kind of bacteria. Bacteria is everywhere, and it could be any kind of bacteria.
My aunt, she's clumsy, but she fell and broke her femur. And obviously femurs was one of the biggest bones to break. And so she had a big incision from her knee up to her hip. And when they sent her home, they didn't send her home in a leg brace. They sent her home in an ace bandage. Didn't tell her anything like, you need to be non-weight bearing, like nothing. So her incision didn't heal correctly, and it got an infection inside of her body, and she was having an internal infection, which was taking over her body, causing her to hallucinate, and like her whole body was just shutting down, and they couldn't figure out why, but she just had a big wound. So there's no telling what all infection.
Oh yeah.
Inside.
So, well, see, and the thing about bacteria is we're covered in bacteria. Most of our bacteria on the surface of our skin is normal. I don't want to say normal. It's non-pathogenic. And even if it was pathogenic, it can't get through our skin. Our skin is our first line of protection. But all it takes is some opening, for something to migrate in there. Because bacteria, as I said, bacteria love warm, dark, moist environments. And, an open wound that's bandaged up is a perfect breeding grounds for it. Now, here's a different disease. This is called Paget's disease. And Paget's disease causes unusual bone growth. And we don't know why. We don't know the cause of it. And the bone growth isn't extra bone. It isn't stronger bone. It is weak bone. It's brittle bone. Look at on the left, you see an x-ray of the ulna and the radius, and you see this unusual growth on the side of the ulna. And over here, we see the the tibia and the fibula. And the tibia looks, first of all, it looks much longer and thinner than it should be. But now you've got this mass growing over here, and it comes and goes. It may be some sort of autoimmune disorder also, because autoimmune disorders do this. They come and go depending on what it is. it may have, different autoimmune diseases or disorders attack different parts of the body at different times. And so with Paget's, we see growth in the long bones and then it goes away, and then we see growth in the pelvis or in the skull and then it goes away. And it's a constant struggle here. We don't know why it's doing it. And this is this is an individual that's afflicted with this. You'll notice that her right femur is about twice as long as the left one, but then the left tibia, and probably the fibula too, is twice as long as the other side. And so, and then it'll grow, it'll come back down to its normal size. But the bones aren't strong. And the fact that they have to help hold her up for the photograph. Look at the shape of the bones of the skull, and her pelvis is also enlarged on one side. Her pelvis seems like it's tilted to accommodate, it's got some unusual growth going there too. Don't know the cause. And it isn't like a malignancy that goes from bone to bone. It just causes this unusual growth, and then it goes away, and then it grows somewhere else, and then it goes away. And the bones are never strong enough to support the weight in here either. So, and we still don't know why. The suggestion is it's viral. I'm suspecting it could be viral. One of the things, the way it comes and goes, to me, it always sounds like it's an autoimmune disorder, because autoimmune disorders do that. They come and go in our bodies. Okay. Now, other things that can happen. Gigantism. This is not a disease. This is a condition. We know what gigantism, why it occurs. Gigantism starts with the pituitary gland at the base of the brain. Remember, the pituitary gland is found in the cella turcica. The pituitary gland starts hyper-secreting growth hormone early on in childhood. And your individual can reach heights of about 8.5 feet. By the time they're an adult, by the time the epiphyseal plates shut down around 23, they're usually between 8 and 9 feet tall. And it's simply because, it starts secreting, the pituitary gland starts secreting growth hormone. The epiphyseal plates respond by generating more bone cells, and the bones get longer and longer and longer, and your individual gets taller and taller and taller, and then eventually tops out. When the plates do close, somewhere between 23 years old, you're looking at someone who's about 8.5 feet tall, somewhere in that neighborhood. The problem with that is that most of these individuals that suffer from gigantism often die relatively early, 50s and 60s, instead of living a full lifespan. The growth hormone stimulates the bones, but it may not be stimulating the viscera to keep up. And so your individual has a much more difficult time living a normal life. So now acromegaly is something that affects individuals after the epiphyseal plates have closed. It's still growth hormone coming here, but you have an individual, maybe they're 30 years old, and the pituitary gland is turned back on. Maybe there's a tumor on the pituitary gland, or maybe it just is acting up and releasing growth hormone. And what will happen then is we'll start getting new bone growth, but only in the bones that can still grow. And that's usually the fingers, the toes, the hands, the feet, and all the facial bones, the frontal bone, the mandible, the maxilla, the nasal bone. And so you're going to see your individual here will be normal stature, whatever normal is. They'll be of a normal stature, but they will have, their hands will get larger, their feet will get larger, their facial bones will enlarge. And they'll still live a normal lifespan, but they're going to have this overgrowth of bone. And then
I wonder if the organs grow too.
Not for acromegaly. So, because it is more of the frontal bone grows, but the temporal and none of these grow. So the brain isn't affected here. The brain has reached its normal size. And so you have this individual though that has this bone growth, and yet, just like in Paget's disease, they are intellectually fine. There are no complications intellectually. They're just as smart as they were before, probably even smarter as they've aged, because supposedly we learn more as we get older, In some cases, the jury's still out on that one, but, so it does occur. It doesn't occur as frequently, any more frequently than gigantism does. It's a rare condition, but it does occur. Now, pituitary dwarfism is just the opposite of gigantism. Here, the growth hormone isn't being released properly during childhood. So, because when we're little, we grow, and we don't have our growth spurts to reach our adult stature until we hit puberty. Well, here we're not getting enough growth hormone to even reach a normal stature, and we would tend to top out at about 4 feet. So the long bones don't grow very much. Now, the one advantage about pituitary dwarfism is we see very few of these individuals anymore, because they can be treated with synthetic growth hormone. So if you have a child at age 14 and they're about 3 feet tall, and they're still, the epiphyseal plates are still active, and if they're treated with synthetic growth hormone, then they can achieve a normal adult stature. It is not there's no genetic anomaly going on here. It's just not enough growth hormone, and we can replace that. So, and they're not going to pass along any genetic problems to their children, just because they were a pituitary dwarf and then they were treated and grew to what we would consider a normal stature. Excuse me. Thank you. There's nothing that they would pass to their children. So now, okay, this is gigantism. At one point, he was the tallest man in the world, but that didn't last long because he died in 1940. He was only 22 years old, but he was about 8 feet 11 inches tall.
So he really up with the car.
Oh yeah, he couldn't fit in the car. I mean, if you consider that the two women standing beside him are of normal stature, 5 something or other, he's still much taller than those. He's standing above the top of the car. And at 5 years old, he was 5 feet 4 inches tall. Can you imagine that at 5 years old? Unfortunately, he had an infection that killed him when he was 22 years old, an infection in his leg. And we don't know if his immune system was compromised. We don't know anything. I don't know anything about that. All I know is that that's not unusual for individuals to die at a younger age. That's pretty unusual. It is unusual to die that young, because most of them are individuals that I've read about tend to die in their 50s and 60s. So, but this is a classic case of gigantism right here. That because his pituitary gland just kept on churning out growth hormone early and didn't stop. So now this is acromegaly. Acromegaly is different than than gigantism. Acromegaly occurs after the epiphyseal plates have closed. So the only bones affected are the hands and feet and the facial bones. And you'll see the hands here. You can see how much longer they've gotten. These the fingers here look almost as long as a foot does. So if you look at the individual on the right, you can see the massive enlargement of the mandible and the nasal bone and even the frontal bone too. This individual was named Rondo Hatton. He was a sports writer. in the 1930s and 40s who developed acromegaly, and he was able to turn that around and move and go into motion pictures, usually horror movies or gangster movies of the 30s and 40s. You want to guess which side of the law he always played on because he was scary looking, you know. But Rondo Hatton made a real a second career out of it, and he died when he was 60 or 65 years old, which was, you know, relatively young. So, but you can see the enlargement of the facial ones. This is a clip from one of his movies. And you can really see the changes in his facial structure. It also affected his speech because, you know, our ability to talk depends on how we manipulate the tongue, and the vocal cords project sound out, and we manipulate words with our tongue and our teeth and our mandible and our maxilla and our nasal cavity, because we use that as a sounding chamber. He talked, had a very guttural sound when he spoke. Anybody ever see The Princess Bride? Andre the Giant, whenever he spoke, remember how he sounded? Andre the Giant had both gigantism and acromegaly. If you have gigantism, you will also have acromegaly. If you have acromegaly, you don't have to have gigantism. And so whenever he spoke, he had it was very hard to understand. Because of the changes in the shape to his mouth. Rondo Hatton, every time he spoke, it sounded the same way. It was a very unusual sound. If I ever find a clip. Yeah, exactly. Yes, you know. So, but he every now and then, if you catch an old movie on TV, you know, he was in quite a few very short appearances, and but he sounded the same way as Andre the Giant did, and Andre the Giant died young too. So, okay, now pituitary dwarfism. Well, make sure you remember the difference between acromegaly and gigantism. Gigantism starts with the pituitary gland secreting in childhood. Acromegaly occurs when the pituitary gland starts secreting growth hormone as an adult. And there's two, it's two different conditions. Now, in pituitary dwarfism, the pituitary gland doesn't secrete enough growth hormone, and you have an individual that hits a stature of about 4 feet. But the development is proportionate. It's not like the little people shows that are on TV, you know. That is a different type of dwarfism. We'll get to that in a second. But a pituitary dwarf is going to have all body parts proportionate, and it can be treated with growth hormone and achieve what we would consider a normal adult stature. We'll say normal because we don't know what normal is, but we'll just say, you know, whatever would be appropriate for the child based on parent size. So, okay. Now here's a good example of pituitary dwarfism. The Munchkins in The Wizard of Oz were all pituitary dwarfs. They all have proportionate, their heads are proportionate to their bodies, their arms and legs are proportionate in size. And so that you have them all here. There were about 60 of them, and it's true that there are about a dozen children scattered throughout here because they didn't have enough Munchkins, so they got small children to participate here. The other little factoid is that Toto got paid more per week than the Munchkins did. So yeah, what can I say? You know, so.
Actually, it scares me. Just the theme song and the witch that gives me the freaks, but that's my favorite. I would go hide when the witch came. But then I always didn't watch the part about him going to see the Wizard of Oz. Like I just didn't care about that part.
Okay, yeah. So I have learned to enjoy it more and more as I, if you can step back and look at the technical aspects of it, this is a 1930 something movie, and they were able to make that horse of a different color, change color right there in front of you. It's like 6 times or 7 times. It's just amazing. So anyway, my wife hates the lion. She just hates the cowardly lion. I don't know why she hates the lion, but anyway, this is pituitary dwarfism. Now, dwarfism comes in 2 categories. The least common is the pituitary dwarfism, but they are easy to identify. Their growth is proportionate. They have, they generally don't achieve more than 4 feet tall in stature, but their arms and legs and their head and their torso are all proportionate to their body size. Now, the most common type of dwarfism produces individuals that are disproportionate, where the head and torso, the head may be normal in size, but the torso is larger and the arms and legs are shorter. And this is what's known as achondroplasia. This is achondroplastic dwarfism. It's a genetic disorder. There's a mutation that affects the ability of the cartilage that is, because our skeleton is initially cartilage, it inhibits the cartilage to ossify and turn to bone like it should. So we don't get proportionate growth. The long bones, the arms and legs stop growing. You get very short legs. The torso looks like, may look like it's enlarged because it's normal size, because you've got short arms and legs and normal torso. It looks like it's really big. The head may look like it's really maybe a bit enlarged too. 70% of all dwarfism is achondroplasia. This is something that can't be treated because it's genetic. It's on chromosome number 4. Not that that's an important factoid to remember, but it is a chromosomal disorder. So there's some mutation taking place on the genes that control long bone growth. And so you end up with, this much shorter stature. The cartilage doesn't convert to bone. Again, they're about 4 feet tall. You have a normal size, an average size trunk, short arms, short legs. You have limited range of motion at the elbows and an enlarged head. And you've seen them on different shows about the little people. And Pigeon Forge has a show on little midget wrestlers right there off of Teaster Lane. My son works at the West Virginia Axe House, right across the parking lot from the midget wrestlers. So I've never asked him if they've ever come in there afterwards, but what can I say? Hey, it's Pigeon Forge, they'll sell anything. Okay, so that's achondroplasia. And here you can see what happened here. If you look at the bones, you can see where there's still lots of cartilage present and the bones aren't ossifying like they should. You see the enlarged head. The torso looks large because it's a normal torso with the short legs. Now, intellectually, there's absolutely nothing wrong with these individuals, just like with pituitary dwarfism, just like with acromegaly, just like with gigantism. Intellectually, they're fine. But it is in this case, it is the lack of bone growth that keeps them at the shorter stature. And a achondroplasiac dwarf is going to also have limitations in lifespan. They're more prone to certain diseases, particularly they're more prone to develop coronary artery disease and have heart issues too. So, and that covers us on bones. And I can get us out of here and now go into muscles. Any questions on this? So let's go into muscles. Okay. Now I want to spend a lot of time on how muscles are stimulated to contract, because the same information in muscles will explain how our nerves do it. And so when we get through this, you'll have a pretty good idea of how our brain can tell our muscles to contract and how the signal gets to the muscle cell. And that's pretty much the same way our nerves themselves communicate to each other. And so you'll get a refresher of it in the next chapter when we get into nerves. And it works. It's just a good way to say it. Okay, first thing, there's our muscle. So musculus, this is a mouse, in case you hadn't noticed. You know, I've actually had people say, "Oh, he's so cute," you know, and he is sort of cute, but
It's struck.
oh, yes. Yeah. So my mother-in-law called me the other day and said, "We've got a mouse over here. Can you come over and do something about it?" And I thought, well, you've got a cat.
Don't feed the cat.
Yeah, don't feed the cat for a couple of days and the mouse will disappear. So, and I said, well, I can come over, but it wouldn't do any good because I wouldn't know where to look for the mouse. So anyway, the reason that I bring up the mouse here is the Latin term name for mouse is mus musculus. And early anatomists noticed that when a mouse was running underneath a blanket, you'd see this little bump move underneath here. You know, I guess the early anatomists were cold and they lived in poorly ventilated, poorly heated houses, and they had a lot of blankets there and a lot of mice. And they'd see the mouse go through there and you'd see this bump as the mouse went through. And they were saying, well, you know, that looks just like what happens in our arms, legs, when they move. There's this bulge on our skin. And they said, let's call those bulges muscles. It's a good story. I think it's mostly true, but you know, the term mus musculus, you know, came from either we named the mouse after the muscle or probably named the muscle after the mouse. So, but it seems to work. Okay. Muscles, they're half of our mass, and they have the ability to transform chemical energy into mechanical energy by making lots and lots of ATP. Chemical energy in the form of glucose is converted to ATP to power contractions of our muscles. So we are busy producing lots of ATP in our skeletal muscles. We're also giving off a lot of heat. 60%, remember in cellular respiration, 60% of the energy that's released comes off as heat. And so the reason we have a constant body temperature is thanks to our skeletal muscle. As they're busy taking the energy out of glucose and making ATP out of it, the 40% they're using to make ATP gives us the power to move things. The other 60% gives us a constant body temperature. So now, if we look at muscles, there's three different categories that we pay attention to. We have, and I'll go over this again, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and skeletal muscle. Cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle look similar. Smooth muscle is different in shape, and it is, well, I'll just save that. And then different functions that muscles do. Besides generating heat and contracting, there's a lot of other things that muscles are involved in. So first of all, here we go. Muscle tissue. Couple prefixes here. If it says myo, if it says mis, if it says sarco, that's sort of like saying osteo or os or something like that. It means muscle. So if we say myo or sarco in there, it'll be a muscle. Sarcoplasm, cell membrane. You know, instead of cytoplasm, sarcoplasm is the membrane of the muscle cell, because we're dealing with individual cells. And we have skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Skeletal muscle and smooth muscle are stretched out. They're elongated. We call them muscle fibers. See, in our muscles, no matter how large the muscle is, the cells run the entire length. So if you have the gastrocnemius, which is 18 inches long, or the quads or the hamstrings, which are longer muscles, the muscle cells run the length of that muscle. And so we call them muscle fibers. Just like in smooth muscle, which surrounds our blood vessels, surrounds our digestive system. They're long, skinny cells. They don't run the length of the digestive system. That would give us a 20-foot long muscle cell, but they're longer, and so they stretch out longer on the shape of like around our blood vessels, around our digestive system. They wrap themselves around there. Skeletal muscle. The skeletal muscles themselves are considered individual organs, like the biceps and the triceps and the hamstrings and the quads. These are all individual organs because they're attached to, they have other tissues involved. They have blood vessels, they have nerves, they have connective tissue, and they're attached to bone. So they are individual organs. The skeletal muscle cells, skeletal muscle fibers, are the longest of all the muscle cells in our body, and they're also striated. They have light and dark stripes in there. And we've seen that. If you go back, remember the AP1, beginning of the lab, when we looked at the different types of tissues, we saw the light and dark bands in there. Now we're going to see what those light and dark bands mean. Skeletal muscle is also a voluntary muscle. It's the only muscle that we can control. We can raise our arm, we can lower our arm, we can manipulate our environment, we can pick things up and put them down. We can't do that with our heart, we can't do that with our digestive system. Skeletal muscle is very, very powerful. We can do all sorts of amazing things with our skeletal muscle. We can lift weights, we can run great distances, we can jump, we can throw things, but our muscles get tired. They tire easily. You can get powerful contractions, but you can't keep it up for a long period of time. A person that can weight lift 1,000 pounds can't do that indefinitely. There's a limit.
One time maybe.
One time maybe, yes, because that exhausts the muscle. And then there's a long period of recovery. So a person that runs a marathon is different than a person who runs, like 100 meters or 200 meters. There you're maximizing your strength full out. You're contracting your muscles as fast as you can, as powerful as you can. But a marathon is endurance. So.
I used to ride mountain bikes and race, and I knew that I had the strength in my muscles, but I started cramping. So I knew right then, I was like, okay, I'm tired, my muscles are tired. And I used to compensate that, it's like electrolyzing things, but even though it didn't suffice because the muscle was tired. It took me a while to understand why I'm taking all these supplements and doing everything that I do. That is because my muscles were tired.
And that's, and you're providing everything they need, but they're still tired and they're fatigued. They can only be stretched to a certain point, and then they have to rest. So yeah, it's a very good point. So they tire easily depending on what you're doing. How you train them to be stronger and more and tire less easily, but there's still some limit. Yeah.
So say someone is a creation center runner.
Okay.
And they don't necessarily like to lift weights, or I guess you could say work out. They just run all the time. And so if they go to work out, maybe they take a day off from running and decide to do, light weights or something, could their body then cramp because they're more used to, I should say, cardio than
it's a
weight,
possibility.
or vice versa? If someone's used to, hardcore weightlifter and then they try to
Yeah.
Start cardio.
Yeah, if someone who's a weightlifter decides to start running, it's a whole different set of uses of the muscles, because, I mean, obviously, if you're going to lift weights, you're going to you still use the abdominal muscles. You have to compress the abdomen, but how much are you going to be using your gastrocnemius, or your quads and hamstrings to lift weight? I mean, there's some because you have to brace yourself, and they're probably going to get tense, but you're not putting a lot of demands on them. On the other hand, if you're a runner, how much are you going to be affecting your torso? And are you going to be, if you start exercising a different set of muscles, you would definitely, that you routinely don't use in whatever your prime sport is, you would probably have to work into it very gradually, so because when you run, I mean, you have arm motion, but there's not a lot of stress on the arms. Your stresses are on your legs and your abdomen. So you could probably, if you decided, I'm going to start lifting lots of weights today. I'm a marathoner and I want to bulk up for whatever reason. That would be, if they didn't approach it slowly, it probably wouldn't end well. So, okay. Skeletal muscle, striated muscle, and voluntary all mean the same thing. They're all under our control. The center of the frontal lobe of the brain tells us what to do, to raise our arms, to lower our arms. All the signals come from there, modified by the cerebellum. We'll talk more about that as we get into the nervous system. But we control our skeletal muscle. Cardiac muscle is only in the heart. And the cardiac muscle is actually a very interesting shape there. The entire heart is not exactly cardiac muscle. The cardiac muscle comes in a series of bands that wrap around the ventricle and wrap around the atria, the top chambers and the bottom chambers. But cardiac muscle is there in a large quantity. It has its own blood supply. The heart has its own coronary circulation to supply these muscles. We don't get it from just what's in the chambers of the heart. Cardiac muscle is striated. It works in the same way that that skeletal muscle does, but we don't control it. It's that mouse. Okay, there we go. It followed me from my mother-in-law's house. The cardiac muscle will contract on its own. Cardiac muscle it's very unique because the heart is a self-starter. The heart doesn't depend on the nervous system. The heart will contract on its own every 7/10 of a second. The only thing we can do with our heart is speed up the heart rate or slow it down. That's the only control we have. But the heart is not directly controlled by the nervous system. It's totally under involuntary control. It has its own pacemaker in the back wall of the upper right chamber. We talk about cardiac muscle, we say cardiac, striated, or involuntary. Smooth muscle is totally different from the first two. Smooth muscle is long and skinny, sort of shaped like a spindle. It is not striated. It is also involuntary. It will contract under control of our nervous system, and we don't have to think about it. It surrounds our stomach, it surrounds our bladder, it surrounds our airways, it surrounds all of our arteries and veins, and tells them to contract or to relax, completely under involuntary control. So the ability to move food through our digestive system is based on smooth muscle that squeezes our digestive tract from the top to the bottom to get foods moved through there. The ability of our stomach to churn food and digest it is thanks to layers of smooth muscle that wrap around it. Again, no, it is we can call it visceral, we can call it non-striated. Usually we just call it involuntary muscle or just smooth muscle. So they look something like this. Here on the left, you see the striated skeletal muscle, the light and dark bands. Something else you see, there are lots of nuclei in here. When we are developing in utero, we started forming skeletal muscle from other cells, and the cells would come together and we would keep the nucleus of all these cells. So in skeletal muscle, we have lots of nuclei. Cardiac muscle in the middle here is also striated, but only one nucleus per cell. And we have these, we see branching. The cardiac muscle cells branch. And the reason they branch is because of the way they're connected. In the heart, every cardiac muscle cell will contract with the same strength every time. Every time it gets a signal, the entire heart will contract together. Whereas in skeletal muscle, we control how many muscle cells we want to use. To pick up the stapler takes less force than picking up the pencil. We control that. We control how many muscle cells we use to pick up the stapler or the pencil or the chair or whatever we're doing. We don't contract every muscle cell in our arm every time. The heart's different. It contracts everything the same time with the same strength. So there's no, and every muscle cell in the heart works together like that, and they're all communicating with each other.
One of the organs in the body works the most, you know, it's constantly moving. Like we talk about cardio being good for you, but you might think like, well, I'm adding strength to the heart and working faster. So and it's good, but I was like, how much is good, you know?
Well, and that's a really good point there. Depending on, you know, the heart, like any other muscle, will become more efficient the more you exercise it. And what we see is someone who is an athlete will have a lower heart rate than someone who's not, and their heart is just as healthy as someone who doesn't exercise. But it beats, it has less contractions per minute, but it sends the same amount of blood out because the contractions are more powerful. So a healthier heart can, you know, doesn't have to work as hard. So a heart that is not healthy has to work harder to reach the same goals. So because every cell has to work. Every cell has to contract with the same force. If we find that one side of the heart's not, if the left side's not keeping up with the right side, then we're going to get an uneven flow of blood and we'll end up with fluid backing up somewhere in the body. And one of the things that the heart does, like a lot of organs do this, if they can't keep up with their demand, they'll start getting bigger. Not because bigger is better, but it's sort of like, well, if they could think, they'd say, well, I can't keep up, but I'll try to get bigger so I can improve. Well, all they do is get bigger. So we get an enlarged heart, you know, because it can't keep up, because when the heart gets bigger, it gets weaker. It doesn't sound like it should, you know, but that's what happens. Now in skeletal muscle, we don't have to contract all the muscle cells at the same time to do the same effect. We control how many muscle cells we're going to use. However, every cell, when stimulated, will contract to its fullest extent. So you may only use 100 muscle cells in your biceps to do something, but every one will have contracted as powerfully as it can. It will contract to its fullest extent. It just depends on how many cells you need, you know, because how many cells do you use to pick this up, or to pick up this, or pick up, you know, the microscope's good and heavy. You know, how many cells do I have to use to pick this up as opposed to a piece of paper? But every cell that was contracted to its fullest extent in here. So those two, that characteristic is true for both muscle cells and cardiac muscle cells. And over here, we saw, this is smooth muscle. It is shaped like a spindle. It's long and thin and pointed at the ends. It has one nucleus per cell. is not striated, it is not branched. We can control each smooth muscle cell is controlled to contract to its fullest extent. How many we need depends on what we want it to do. But that's controlled by the central nervous system. Okay. Muscle cells or muscle tissue all have these same characteristics. They're always excitable. They will respond to a stimulus. So they have responsiveness. If you stimulate the muscle cell, it will contract. And that's what its second characteristic is. Contractility, the ability to shorten when stimulated. So first of all, the muscle cell can receive a stimulus. It's alive, it's not dead. It can receive a stimulus. The second thing is when it's stimulated, it will always contract, and it will contract to its fullest extent. It will shorten as much as it can. Now, something else, muscle cells can be stretched. When you were riding your mountain bike, your muscles got tired because you were stretching out the muscles. They were contracting again and again, and they got tired. However, they were also elastic, like a big rubber band. When you stretch them out and let go, it's going to come back to its same shape. Your muscle cells, it wasn't like it stretched out, and like bubble gum, you stretch it out and it doesn't come back. It just stays stretched out. Our muscles, they'll stretch, but when you let go, they're going to come back to their original shape. So they may be tired, but they'll still come back. So rubber band does the same thing. And I said the other day when I was talking about this, I would get a rubber band, and of course I didn't. So take my word for it. So, okay. What else do muscles do? Well, they produce movement. Regardless of what of the three types, they're going to control voluntary action of the arms and legs and hands and feet and fingers and toes. They're going to contract our heart and pump blood, and they're going to squeeze our arteries and veins. They're going to squeeze our digestive system. They're going to churn our stomach. They're going to force our bladder to empty out when we pee. All these are going to be movement, whether we're walking or we're digesting or we're pumping blood. They're going to hold our body into its proper position for activities. It maintains our posture, standing upright, sitting down, laying down. Whatever position we need to be in, it will maintain that posture for us. It holds our joints together, because consider how complicated our shoulder is and our knee is, and yet the muscles are and the tendons pulling on the bones around these joints hold everything together, and they generate lots of body heat. 60% of our heat comes from muscle contractions, mostly the skeletal muscle. So now we're going to focus mostly, I should say primarily, I've said mostly too much, on skeletal muscle. It's an organ. It has nerves, it has a blood supply. It's surrounded by connective tissue, and it has attachments on it so that it can attach itself to the bone. Every muscle is supplied by at least one nerve, one artery, and one vein. And those arteries and nerves are going to branch out. The veins will branch out. Every muscle cell, in fact, is in direct contact with one nerve. So every muscle cell, you may have 10,000 muscle cells in your biceps. I don't know the number, I'll just say 10,000. And every individual muscle cell is in contact with a nerve, so that every muscle cell can be controlled by the nervous system. And if you are a contracting muscle cell, you need lots of oxygen and lots of glucose, and you got to get rid of the waste products very quickly. So you have to have a very good vascular system here, because you're going to be using up lots of oxygen. you're going to be breaking down lots of glucose. Now, and we got to get rid of that carbon dioxide. We got to get rid of any metabolic byproducts that occur. We got to get rid of the extra water that may get formed here. So, and of course, we need lots and lots of glucose. Now, skeletal muscle cells have lots of glycogen embedded around them. So they can break the glycogen down to get glucose. They also store lots of oxygen for them. Skeletal muscle cells are red because of the presence of what we call a respiratory pigment known as myoglobin. It's what, you go down to Food City, for example, and you go through the beef counter and everything's red. It's red because of the presence of the myoglobin in the meat. It's not blood. That cow has been drained of its blood long before the beef ever hits the shelves in the store. So when you get a piece of beef and you want it rare or medium rare, and there's this red liquid draining out of it, that's myoglobin. It's not blood, but the myoglobin stores oxygen for us. And so when a muscle is contracting, it always has a lot of stored oxygen available. So if you're running a marathon or you're doing some strenuous activity, you're going on a long hike in the mountains, whatever, and you're being chased by a bear for a while, apparently that seems to be the problem recently up in the park, but you're going to burn up a lot of glucose. You're going to use up a lot of your oxygen. And it's entirely possible to reach a point where you are experiencing what's known as oxygen debt, where you have used up all your stored oxygen. And you're only using the oxygen now that's being delivered to your tissues through the circulatory system. You can still function fine on that. You just won't be producing a lot of energy. It takes a lot for cellular respiration to occur in skeletal muscle. We got to have a lot of oxygen available. Once we deplete that stored oxygen, then we switch over from cellular respiration to simple glycolysis. We can still get energy, but we're not depending on the stored oxygen anymore. We experience oxygen debt, and it takes us about 24 hours to recover after a long strenuous period of activity, like riding your bike, or if you decide to hike up to Mount LeConte and you go up one of the steeper trails like Alum Cave, for example, and then you go up and come back down and you're exhausted and your muscles hurt and they're in oxygen debt, so they can still function, but they don't have enough stored oxygen for about 24 hours. So we depend on a lot of oxygen. In fact, we'll get into this later on, but after death, it takes our skeletal muscle cells, the individual cells don't really start dying off for somewhere between 10 and 12 hours after death, because they, they still have lots of glucose and lots of oxygen that they can use. They don't have a circulatory system to take those wastes away, and they're going to accumulate, but they can still generate energy for hours after death. So yeah, it is, so now, if you are a skeletal muscle cell, or if you are a skeletal muscle, then you have lots of connective tissue around you. And if we start from the outside of the muscle, we have a layer of connective tissue called the epimysium. Epi means outside. This is the outer covering of a muscle. This runs into the tendon. This connective tissue layer surrounds the muscle and eventually forms a tendon that attaches the muscle to the bone, because muscles don't attach directly to a bone, they attach indirectly. Now, if we go a little deeper into the muscle, we find that the muscle cells that make up the muscle, all these muscle fibers and muscle cells, are clustered together in groups. Maybe a couple hundred muscle cells together in a group. Each group is called a fascicle. just a cluster of cells. But the fascicles are surrounded by another layer of connective tissue known as the paramycium. And then if you look at the individual cells, each one of those is surrounded by a layer of connective tissue called the endomycium. So if a muscle cell contracts all by itself, one cell, it will pull on its connective tissue layer, the endomycium. That will pull on the layer surrounding the fascicle that that cell's in. And then that fascicle, the paramycium surrounding that particular fascicle will pull on the epimycium, and the muscle will contract. Now, you may not, one cell, you're not going to see much of a contraction. You're probably not even going to notice it. However, but the contraction is being passed from the individual cell up to the surface of the cell itself by pulling on these layers of connective tissue. And it looks something like this. If you look, this is a muscle cell. I mean, this is a muscle cut in half. Here is the epimycium here. That's its outer layer of connective tissue. And you can see how the epimycium, if you look to the left, it runs into the tendon, which attaches to somewhere around the head or neck of the femur, probably around the trochanter, one of the trochanters there, or maybe the crest in between. It doesn't matter for our discussion here. But what we're seeing is the epimycium forms the tendon. It's the outer layer. Within the muscle, you have clusters of fascicles. That's what this is sticking out here. This oval shaped structure, that's a fascicle. And within each, and the fascicle is surrounded by a layer of connective tissue. Here is the paramycium. These are all fascicles. All these oval shaped structures here are fascicles, and each fascicle is filled, has lots of individual cells. Here we see the structure sticking out by itself, where it says muscle fiber. This is one cell right here. And so your fascicle is made up with hundreds of these individual cells in here, and the muscle cell itself has a layer of what we call the endomycium. That's the connective tissue layer. And what it really looks like, and the illustration is not bad, but up here at the inset, this is what it really looks like. This is the endomycium layer. Let's see. This is a fascicle right here, and each one of these are going to be individual muscle cells, and that's an endomycium surrounding one cell, which you can't see. But here's the epimycium on the outside. So we go epi, peri, endo. And you know, nerves are built the same way, but nerves don't contract, but they're built in the same type of structure with fascicles and what we call an epineurium and a perineurium and an endoneurium. But we'll get into that when we get into nerves. But it's the same structure, just like you would have it here, except nerves don't have to contract. Okay. And something we've said about muscles in lab, muscles attach to bones. They have an insertion and an origin. You know, the connective tissue is going to hold it to a bone that moves and a bone that doesn't move. The insertion is a movable bone, and the origin is the immovable bone. In both cases, they're held by the connective tissue that form the tendons. So, some terms here. Sarcolemma is the cell membrane. Sarcoplasm is the cytoplasm. Lots of glycosomes, instead of lysosomes or something like that, we have lots of glycosomes to store glucose in the form of glycogen, and lots of myoglobin present. That's the stuff that makes the muscle cells red. We have other structures in here. We have what are known as myofibrils, and the myofibrils are going to make up the individual cells. We have what's known as the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Remember the endoplasmic reticulum from chapter 3, I think it was, on cells. the series of tubules that surround the nucleus. Well, here we have one specialized just for muscle cells. We have another structure here called T-tubules. T-tubules are actual tubes that extend from the surface of the cell down all the way through the body of the cell. It's a passageway for nerve communication so that every part of the cell is stimulated at exactly the same time. Now, the myofibrils they look like rods. They, every muscle cell will have thousands of these individual myofibrils. The myofibrils are where the striations are located. The light and dark bands in skeletal muscle show up in the myofibrils. We have what's known as the contracting unit of the skeletal muscle, and that's the sarcomere. That's found in the myofibril also. The actual level of contraction takes place at this very tiny structures where you have probably millions of these sarcomeres inside a myofibril. The myofibril is made up of something called myofilaments. And this is where it gets easily confusing, because now you have muscle fibers, then you have myofibrils, now you have myofilaments. So yeah, it's very easy to get confused in this. The muscle fiber is the cell. And every time I say cell, I'll say fiber. Every time I say fiber, I'll say cell. So we make sure there's no confusion on that. The myofibrils are made up of the myofilaments. The myofilaments are the actual contracting proteins that slide across each other. And so that'll become real clear here in a second. So what are the molecular composition of the myofilaments? Well, there's two types of protein, one called actin, one called myosin. So there is our muscle fiber right there. There's a myofibril sticking out on the right-hand side. You see the myofibrils are packed inside the cell. There's thousands of these inside a cell. Now, if the cell runs the length of the muscle, so do the myofibrils. They run the length of the muscle too. And we see the light and dark bands occurring on the myofibril. So if the muscle cell is 12 inches long, every myofibril inside the muscle, inside the cell, will be 12 inches long too. And all these light and dark bands here are going to show up. That's why when we look at a slide of skeletal muscle, we see the striations in here. The striations are coming from these light and dark areas in the myofibrils. Everybody happy with this? Okay. Now, the light bands and the dark bands, we have names for them. We call the dark areas the A band. The dark stripes are the A band, and the dark stripes are surrounded on each side by a light band. And the light band is called the I band. So if you look at the light and dark areas here in this illustration, you can see there's a dark A band with a light band on either side of it. And if you look carefully at the light band, you can see there's a line right down the middle of it. That's called the Z line. So three terms you need to remember here: the A band, the I band, and the Z line. A band is the dark band, the I band is the light band, and the Z line is in the middle of the I band. So the myofilaments are made up of actin and myosin. They form what's the contracting unit of the cell, of the muscle, called the sarcomere. The actin are what are called the thin filaments. The actin are found mostly in the I band. They are found they go all the way across the I band, and they extend partway into the A band. So the I band is the light area, the A band is the dark area. So these thin filaments make up all the I band, but stretch out into the A band. Now the A band is made up of myosin. Myosin are the thick filaments. So we only have thin and thick filaments here. Thin filaments are actin, thick filaments are myosin. The A band is made up completely of myosin. The myosin is, well, let me rephrase that. The myosin covers the width of the A band. The myosin doesn't go anywhere else. Now the actin will overlap the myosin here, and it looks something like this. This is what's known as a sarcomere. Sarcomeres run from Z line to Z line. Out here is the light band out here. The A band's out, I'm sorry, the I band's out here. This is another I band over here. There's your Z line in the middle of each I band. See how here it's light because we only have actin here and here. And here is the A band where we have the overlap of myosin and the actin. The myosin is a much thicker filament. It's about 10 times the size of the thin filament, the actin. And this is what we're used to looking at. If we look under the microscope, we'd see a flattened version of this. But here we see a Z line, or Z disc. We call it, at some point we stopped calling it Z disc, call it a line. But here's a Z line here, and here's a Z line here. This is one myofibril, and it's made up of tens of thousands of these filaments in here. And there's your Z line. So this is an I band right here, a light band. Over here's another light band at the another in here. That's an I band and an I band, light, with a Z line down the middle. Now the A band is the dark band here, and that has both myosin and actin overlapping. Now, when you look at it under the microscope, all you see, you don't see the actins, you don't see the myosins, all you see are light and dark. So it's light, the light bands are there because there's only the actin present. The dark bands are there because you have both the myosin and the actin overlapping. So we have a light and dark band. The sarcomere, the contracting unit of the, when we get down to it, the sarcomere, the area from Z line to Z line, is the contracting unit of the muscle cell. So when a muscle cell contracts, every sarcomere is going to shorten in every myofibril of the cell. So when one cell contracts, all 10,000 or 10 million myofibrils contract, and every sarcomere within every myofibril will contract to their fullest extent. And they line up one after another after another. Now the structure of the actin and the myosin let this happen. They let this contraction happen. The thick filaments are made up of myosin. Myosin has, each molecule has two heads and two tails linked together. So for every molecule of myosin, you have these two heads. The myosin molecule looks like a driver in golf, a golf club driver. And like actually looks like it's a wooden driver. Think about it there. But they come together. There's about, in every thick filament, you're going to have about 300 myosins attached to it, but spreading out in both directions. So you're going to have about 300 or so molecules coming together, and they have these heads stick up on the thick filament. Now those heads have the ability to pivot back and forth. And so the heads are located at different regions along the entire thick filament. See how these myosin heads, they're not all found at one end. They're scattered throughout here. And so the myosin heads are going to be what actually moves the the sarcomere, because the myosin heads are going to be able to reach up and grab onto the actin that's above them and below them and yank it and pull it towards the middle of the sarcomere. So the actual motion, the myosin heads are going to pivot back and forth, and then they're going to drag the actins over top of the myosin. Here's what our actin looks like. Actin is a thin molecule. The actin protein is put together in a double helix structure. You can see the spiral shape of it there. Those little actin proteins, they look like little blueberries, but on each actin protein making up the thin filament, there is an area called the myosin binding site. And that's where the myosin heads are going to grab onto the actin. Now, just to complicate things, we have another protein here called tropomyosin, a long, skinny protein that wraps itself around the actin and conveniently blocks every one of those binding sites. You'll notice that the tropomyosin runs across all those dark spots on the blueberry. Every one of those dark spots is where the myosin head can reach up and grab it and give it a yank, but they're blocked because the tropomyosin's in the way. Now, conveniently for us, there's another protein involved called troponin. Troponin are those little yellow things that stick down there. If the troponin moves out of the way, it will drag the tropomyosin with it. And if the tropomyosin is dragged out of the way, then the myosin head can grab the actin and yank it. But as long as it's blocked, nothing happens. Because we don't want to, this is sort of a good thing because we don't want to have our muscle cells, skeletal muscle cells contracting all the time. We want to be able to control it. And the control is based on are these binding sites open or are they closed? And so we have to find a way though to get the troponin to roll over and take the tropomyosin with it. Now, a couple other things that happen here. It isn't just the actins and the myosins. There is an elastic filament present because we want to, we don't want to overstretch. We call it tighten. This elastic filament here holds the myosins in place so that they don't get stretched. And after they've been contracting, they can relax. There's a protein called dystrophin that holds the thin filaments in place and attaches them to the cell membrane. Because we want to, we have to pull the membrane. If we're going to contract the sarcomere, we got to pull the membrane along too. It would be like trying to move your arm and not have the skin go with it. That would be very exciting one time. Because your arm the skin has to stretch when you're moving around. We don't want to have it break or tear. So dystrophin does the same thing to the cell membrane. It attaches the actins to the cell membrane so the cell membrane can go along with the contraction. And we have some other proteins here that keep the sarcomere lined up so it doesn't get tilted. But the two important ones are going to be the titin and the dystrophin. And that leads us into our first health issue. Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. You've probably all heard of muscular dystrophy at some point. Never heard of it? Okay. Anybody ever heard of it? Okay. It is a genetic disorder caused by the inability to produce enough dystrophin to hold the actin to the cell membrane. It is an inherited disorder. It's sex-linked, so it usually shows up in male children inherited from their mother. Most of the sex-linked disorders show up in males, like male pattern baldness. It comes from the mother. Color blindness usually comes from the mother also. Yeah.
Is it true, like if a guy looks at his mom's dad, he should be able to tell if he would be bald at that same age? Like it's from his mom, but they would look at like their grandfather.
That's not unusual, because the gene for male pattern baldness is passed through the mother. So if the male had, the male received that gene from his mother, then it manifests itself. I knew friends in college who started going bald at 20. Male pattern baldness. Actually, they were going bald in high school, really aggressive. So, but yeah, that's a pretty good example. Yeah, because the gene is running through the family then, and so the male will develop male pattern baldness simply because of that. It is and just like Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, this is what will happen here is that the gene that produces the dystrophin isn't there. And so what will happen is that the muscle cell, and it's a progressive disorder, the muscle cells are not going to be able to contract properly. They'll damage the sarcolemma. The sarcolemma will tear open. Calcium will come in, inflame the muscle cells, and destroy them. And it'll get worse and worse. And usually an individual with muscular dystrophy will live to about 25 or 30 and then die from respiratory failure. So it is a sex-linked disorder. It shows up, as I said, about 1 in every 3,600 live births will have this. It's just, again, no fault of anybody. It's just the gene got passed on. So, okay, that is. On that cheery note, we'll just go ahead and call it a day. So, and we'll pick up with this on Wednesday. Any questions on anything? Okay, then let's get out of here.